Hi, welcome back if you've watched my videos before, and if you're discovering this channel. My name is Chris. I'm a real French teacher in real reality. I really do teach French, and the school is really called We Communicate, of which you should be aware. From San Diego to Portland, from New York to Paris, I've seen all the schools and none of them had this. French is cute if you know it one way. English to French, the full spectrum, I say. It's called being bilingual, a rare skill indeed. I say, speak you English? Some French might you need. In a league of its own, this school plays the game. Let this truth hit home, it's not all the same. Let's start. Fear the French slang and you speak. If you want, because a more linguistics-based explanation will have you fear it no more. Now, this was the original title for the video, but for room constraints, I couldn't call it that, so I just call it Fear the French slang and you speak. If you want, because a more linguistics-based explanation will have you fear it no more. This is the official title of the video. Well, since you're here, you either enjoy a good scare or you're interested in the potential problem of French slang on your road to French and probably even moving to France, so, well, I propose we talk about it. Let's start with the first problem, what you've probably heard so far. You might have already heard from amusing videos on YouTube that French has its share of slang. It also has changes of vocabulary according to regions: France, Quebec, Belgium, Switzerland. You might also have seen the YouTube teachers telling you that the way you said things in your French class did not reflect the proper way of saying them in French in everyday life. And now you're confused even more. Now, the purpose of this article will be to hit the brakes on a lot of these myths and propose a more sobering explanation of French slang and, dare I say, a more linguistics-based and scientific-based explanation on French slang. Because you might know that the science of linguistics has long shone a light in the dark caves of the language and told the good country folk to put away their gardening tools because there was no terrible beast to slay. To further help us out of the darkness, it even gave names to these phenomenons. As they say in Latin, scientia vincere tenebras. Science beats the darkness. The word sociolect refers to the traits of a language that are shared by a social group. Within a sociolect, we have jargons. For example, these are the specialized terms used by people of a certain profession, or it could be a sport even. Players of golf have a jargon. Dentists have a jargon also. The word hacker, for example, was only used by certain people in the IT industry until it became mainstream. Lots of terms from the 1940s jazz scene in America came into ordinary talk, such as the word groovy or hip, right? These are specialized terms used within a certain industry or social group. There were most probably many other terms of jazz slang in the 1940s, the sociolect, that died down and didn't make it into ordinary vocabulary, mainstream vocabulary, just as there would have been terms of jargon used by a 1940s dentist that a modern day dentist wouldn't be able to understand, and vice versa. And this is one of the first rules of slang, as we're calling it in this video. It changes with time, geography, and sticks around according to forces that are hard to pinpoint. Now, we all know of an expression that we used in our youth that's fallen out of fashion, but a word, for example, such as cool, which is almost 80 years old, is, well, still cool. I find that using the term slang is the first problem because it's too wide, it's too broad, and it shouldn't be used at all ideally, because it confuses the receiver of the information, the French student in this case, and shows that the giver of the information is confused also, meaning that everyone ends up confused. To properly understand the matter of slang, or sociolects as they should be called, I think we should carefully distinguish between categories of slang. It's not one and all the same thing. For example, the latest buzzword that's shared by a certain youth group, a swear word known by all the French speakers, and an innocent word that belongs to a more informal register. It's not all the same. There are different types of slang, and we should also ask ourselves who uses these words, in which context, and what is the shelf life of these informal French terms. Let's now talk about the function of slang, or sociolects as we should probably be calling them. As we mentioned already, A word that's only known to a small group of insiders in a certain social group usually has a purpose and a shelf life. It can also have other variables such as age group, geography, and even gender. And sometimes the use of slang can even be explained by sociology and psychology. I feel that the main question here is, when we approach French slang, is how much of an impact will it have on your journey to France or Francophonia, and how much of an impact will it have on your learning of French? Here's a funny comparison to put the problem of slang into perspective. If the world of today had been possible in the 1940s, the way we've built up the problem of slang would be like having a French visitor, a French person, worry about a potential visit to America because they'd heard that jazz musicians were using specialized English terms that were hard to understand for a user of ordinary English. And it's a problem that would be magnified like only the internet can do. Still with the example of jazz, this community used specialized terms for several effects that are usually psychological. So it allowed the jazz musicians, the people who belong to this community, to reinforce the belonging and, of course, exclude the outsiders. So we see this also with local accents. This is why people do have local accents. You know, they show that you belong, and they reassure the tribe that you belong to the tribe. These jazz musicians from the 40s probably invented the word groove to describe a reality that belonged to their activity as musicians, simply because the word was missing, so there wasn't a proper word to express their feeling, what they were feeling when they were playing that music. So these principles are true also in modern day France, in modern day America, and the rest of the world. For example, a hashtag can become a word or verb. It might disappear next year, or it might hang around for 10 years. Now, I think the true question in the question of slang, when we talk about slang, is, well, how marginal are these words, and how much of an impact will it have on me as a non-native speaker of French? I recently read a post somewhere, I think it was Facebook, in which someone used the verb mexiting, and as a way of saying doing what I want, or stepping away from my responsibilities, or can't handle the pressure. And I find it interesting, and it's anyone's guess if this is going to hang around, turn into a mainstream word, or just disappear within a word or two. And of course it refers to Meghan, you know, who Brexit, Meghan exit, the Mexit. And some people have started to use it as a verb, but you know, here we can ask ourselves what the function is of using mexiting. You know, it's about reinforcing a group. You know, do you get the reference? It's and that's the purpose of slang. But I think the question is, well, how marginal is it? You know, how important is it to understand mexiting, and how long will it hang around before it disappears? In our conversation today, in this video about French slang, I think it will be important to understand what we're talking about exactly when we speak about French slang, in order to tone down the confusion and not give this potential obstacle a size it doesn't deserve. Let's not fear the badly named boogeyman and make it out to be more dangerous than it really is. Next thing I'd like to talk about is, will slang be a problem for me as a non-native speaker of French visiting a country of Francophonia, be it France, Belgium or any other? And here's my take on it. When visiting or even residing in a Francophone country as a non-native speaker of French, slang will not be a problem for you for several reasons that I propose to get into now. As we saw with our examples of dentists, golf players or musicians, a sociolect, or slang as we're calling it, has the function of describing realities that belong to that group, but also for a bonding effect. It implicitly reassures the users of slang that they are on the same wavelength, you know, such as mexiting. If you use mexiting in a sentence, well, you're sort of implicitly checking, are you on my wavelength? Do you get the reference? Are we part of the same, I don't know, the readers of the same magazine? Do we share the same sort of pop culture? Do we say this, you know, do we share a similar interest in, I don't know, fashion, trends? That's really what it implicitly means, you know, when you use mexiting. Do you get the insider's joke? And it has a bonding effect. So using slang has a true bonding effect between people who belong to a certain social group. As a non-native speaker of French, meaning probably yourself if you're learning French, now the locals will already have seen through your mannerisms, your accent, I don't know, your demeanor, within seconds, and it's really very, very quick, that you are not exactly on the same wavelength as them, because precisely you're not a native speaker of French. So they'll instinctively adapt their way of speaking to a more middle-of-the-road way of using French. And this is also why we speak more proper when we go to the dentist or when we speak to a lawyer, because the rules of linguistics have long explained to us that we adapt our way of speaking according to circumstances. I can give two more examples of this. If you've ever been to the UK, this is the reason they always say, "You're right, mate." You know, they want to know if you're part of the gang or not. Are you a mate or not? And if you answer to that question, "Yes, sir, jolly good weather we're having," that is not the proper answer. You know, you're not part of the gang, unless it could be the proper answer. If you want to make it clear that you have nothing in common with a person, then in this case, by all means, you can answer that. But this is what they're implicitly testing. Are you part of the gang? Like, are you a mate? Like a second example, if you've ever seen the film Catch Me If You Can with DiCaprio, when he wanted to be an airline pilot, one of the first things he did was to learn all the jargon that the airline pilots used, or to be able to fit in socially. And it's always the same mechanism we're seeing. So let's imagine this same situation in France. Practically, I think there are very, very low chances that a French worker doing a job, for example, on your garden fence, is ever going to say, "C'est complètement pété." Very low chances of that ever happening, and they're more likely going to say, "C'est cassé." They'll have no incentive to try and bond with you. You see, because they already feel you're not on the same wavelength, so they're not going to use slang to try and bond with you as they would probably with a local, and they'll rather want to make themselves well understood, because it's more of a business transaction, isn't it? They're repairing your fence. And it's not something they'll rationalize, no one does, but they'll rather do instinctively, as we all do. Similarly, a mechanic in France is not going to use the word bagnole, but instead they're going to use voiture. A trader's not going to say "J'ai pas de fric sur moi." They're going to say "Je n'ai pas d'argent sur moi." Your neighbor won't tell you "Fait pétant chaud aujourd'hui." They'll rather say "Il fait très chaud." They won't throw out "Ça caille," but they'll rather say "Il fait froid." An acquaintance won't tell you "On va se taper sur un banc, quoi." But they will rather say "On va s'asseoir sur le banc." No one's ever going to tell you, "I don't believe, ça fait des plombes, j'en touche plus une en anglais." They're probably going to say, "I speak English not very well, it is a long time." That's likely what's going to happen. People are not going to start using French in order to have this effect of bonding. You see, that's rather something they're going to do with locals. People are going to adapt to your circumstances, which will be made evident by your English accent anyway, and they might at times forget the boundaries between informal speaking and formal speaking, and, you know, slip in a sentence that you might not get, but just as soon clarify this if they see any sort of puzzlement on your face, because they want to be well understood. And linguists, again, have long explained the dynamics of the conversation, of communication, in which clarity is a founding principle. When you communicate with someone, you want to be understood, which is why there would have been no reason to use slang words. For this reason, it will be in no one's interest to confuse you. We can go back to our example of the garden fence, you know, someone repairing the garden fence. If they say, "Oh, c'est complètement pété, tout ça," and you look at them, well, you know, well, pardon, say, "Oh, c'est complètement pété, le truc là." Why would they speak like that? First of all, they're not bonding with you. They want to be clearly understood, because these are the rules of communication followed by everyone universally. So they'll probably slow down and say something like "C'est cassé." You know, the wind blew down the fence or something, "C'est cassé," because they want to be understood. They'll have no incentive to be not understood. Right, to finish this video, I propose we break down into the little categories the different parts of what we call slang, and in which cases it might realistically appear. I think just as linguistics does when they shine a little light in the dark caves of the language, it can be interesting to break this down into categories to know what we're talking about when we talk about slang. Well, the first one is written and spoken. Now, steps aside from standard French will be taken in different measures according to whether the message is written or spoken. So there's already a difference here. Text message French exists just as it does in English. For example, as used by teenagers, will likely have very little impact on your journey into French or your stay in France, precisely because they won't be directed towards you. If teenagers text in some type of French that you wouldn't understand, well, they're doing it to reinforce their social group. It won't be directed towards you, and you have, in other words, no reason to worry about it. Another distinction might be between young and old. As we saw already, one of the purposes of slang is to solidify the belonging to a social group. Younger people would have no interest in trying to include you in their community, sorry to say, of teenagers, unless you are a teenager. And here also, I don't believe it will have much of an impact. Category number 3 is the distinction between long-term and short-term when we speak of slang. Slang can range from extremely underground to extremely commonplace. It can hang around for a short year or a full century. For example, the word cops in English is considered a regular word that's necessary in the language. It's not an underground word, right? Anyone learning English should know the word cops. So we must distinguish between French slang words that are shared by the majority of the country or the whole country, and we must know these when we learn French. For example, bagnole is you could call it a slang word that's necessary to know. It's not an underground word. You should know the word bagnole, even though it belongs to a more familiar register. Also the word toubib for a doctor. Someone might use toubib in a familiar register, informal register. These are slang words that are important to know. So there's a distinction between the underground and the slang words, the informal words that are shared by a large majority of users. Another distinction is between vulgar and proper. French has words that belong to the vulgar register, as do all languages probably, and these include insults and sex. Unless we expect to be called names in a vulgar sort of way, it will likely not much be of a concern either. Being called son of a whatever will, I don't know, how many times does it happen in a year? I suppose it depends who you hang out with. Perhaps they'll occasionally find use in a French film? I don't know. Maybe. Number 5, references to a shared culture. Some sentences you hear in French might refer to a well-known catchphrase, a proverb, a film, or even a novel. So these are references to a culture. Now these have a similar function to strengthen the bond between people who get the reference. Saying something like "Voilà la cavalerie" or "Jour après jour l'oiseau fait son nid" will likely not be placed in a conversation that is addressed to you directly. So a French speaker, hearing your English accent, knowing that you're struggling somewhat, they would have no incentive to say "Jour après jour l'oiseau fait son nid" or "Ah, voilà la cavalerie." Why would they throw that out, knowing you probably won't get the reference? Number 6, regional speech patterns. These variations can be seen on the scale of a nation or, on the contrary, on a more local scale. Practical examples are, for example, a certain accent that can be traced back to France or Belgium or Switzerland. There might also be words that describe a typical French reality and not the reality of someone in Switzerland. For example, the word mairie is a lot more important in France and has more use in France than, for example, in Belgium, where the equivalent is la commune. There are hardly ever uses. There are almost no uses of the word mairie in Belgium simply because we don't use mairie, it's la commune instead of la mairie. So for that reason there might be words that describe the French reality. The same object also might be called by different names according to different countries or different regions. We have this in the English language also. For example, the word ghetto in France can refer to a biscuit, like a little cookie that you dip in your tea, as well as a cake. But I think that on the scale of the French language and the problem it represents, these little local variations or national variations, it really represents 0.000% of the language and nothing to worry about. Number 7, abbreviations. As we know, words are sometimes shortened. We might say Chris instead of Christopher. These are usually shared by speakers on a wide scale, interestingly, or risk losing their function, especially if they require a longer explanation than originally intended. You know, the purpose of an abbreviation is not to say a long word, but a short word instead. So they have to be shared by a majority, otherwise each time you use your abbreviation you have to explain to someone who doesn't get it. Examples of such include apéro in any French speaking country, apéro instead of apéritif. So instead of saying on prend l'apéritif, you might hear on prend l'apéro. It's an abbreviation. And déo for deodorant. But if someone doesn't get it, well, you have to say, oh, I'm going to fetch déo. What? Deodorant. Oh, sorry, now you've wasted time. So they have to be shared by a majority of people. But again, nothing to worry about here either. And number 8, all the rest, the last minute surprises, things that we're not prepared for. Could they happen? Yes, of course, they could happen. Is it ever a major obstacle to communicate with French speakers? I don't think so. I would say absolutely not. There might be things that I've missed in these 7 categories, but yes, there are always surprises, of course there are, but I think it will remain marginal. Thank you very much for watching, and now I think I'm going to ad-lib a bit and step away from the article, which you can find on the website, and have a more of an informal chat. Let's do this. Ooh, stretching. Right, so this will be the informal part of the article, of the video, and we'll talk about French slang. I think, well, as many things, I mean, if you're watching this video, it's probably because you're concerned about French slang, and I'm guessing that you heard that French slang was a thing, that you heard that from YouTube teachers or someone else scared you or told you watch out, because many people are making these videos. I mean, my wife showed me a video 2 days ago, it was on Saturday, and she said, oh look, and look at this, you know, the difference between Canadian French and French French, and she showed me 3 fellas saying, I think they mentioned the petit déjeuner, the breakfast, the watermelon, and something. I think it's sort of trending on what's it called, on Instagram. But it's funny because my take on it, not to look down, you know, because, you know, I do make this distinction between linguist and non-linguist, and it's sort of like a doctor sees a problem, you know. I just see a wound and I see blood everywhere and I'm on full alert and I say, oh, look, I'm wounded. But a doctor will say, okay, what's actually going on? It's a more scientific look into the problem. Now, my background is in linguistics. I studied this, so almost want to apologize, but I think my state of alert won't be the same as someone who's making these well, first of all, receiving this information, watch out their slang, and also I think that a lot of the people making these videos, I'm sorry to say, don't quite know what they're talking about, because they're not locating the problem in a scientific type of way. They're not clearly seeing in their own language, into their own language. They might use French as native speakers, yeah, but they're not locating the problem. They're not locating the degree of, what's the noun, marginality or marginalness. It's a marginal problem. So these 3 fellas that I watched in this video, well, they were on about, how do we say, le petit déjeuner in France, le déjeuner à midi, and they didn't mention the evening, but petit déjeuner and déjeuner. And then they said, oh, in Canada, how do you say it? And of course they were laughing, they were finding this very amusing. And I think they just say le déjeuner, I know they say le casse, oh, I've forgotten now, in Canadian French. Anyway, I've forgotten what the word was, but there was a way, I think the petit déjeuner in France was the déjeuner in Canada, Quebec, and le déjeuner at 12 o'clock in France was something else in Canadian. But I do remember the example of the watermelon. It was la pastèque in standard French, and it was le watermelon, le melon d'eau in Canadian French, and le dentifrice, that's the toothpaste, in standard French, and la pâte à dents in Canadian French. And of course, I mean, it puts people on, it creates a sense of fear It's, oh, what is this language? All these variations and these slang words, but it's a marginal problem because a word is just a word. What really holds the language together are the major tools, the major foundations of French, and these don't change very much between all the countries of France, or that use French, sorry, as a native language. I think this conversation on French slang and the fear it might represent is largely created by, I don't know, people who make videos or YouTube teachers, and statistically it's not going to have much of an impact because there are social reasons to use slang and a jargon, and it usually ties people together within a community. So if you, as an outsider to that community anyway, through your English accent or from simply not being a native speaker of French, I mean, they would have no reason to use this slang on you. It might be more relevant if you're in your 20s and you wish to hang out with young people, but then again, they're going to include you into their slang because it will be in their interest to, well, first of all, they're probably going to be happy to teach you, or if you have teenage kids, you know, to teach your teenage kids the latest slang word. So there won't be an obstacle there. And the teenage, if you have teenage kids who now live in France with you, if you've moved to France, well, they'll be happy to learn the French slang word, and the native speakers of French will be happy to teach it. And they'll be very happy not to include grown-ups in their slang word because it's not the function of slang. Now, I think the second major thing is to distinguish between underground slang, which, such as an example of teenagers, you know, typing on their keyboards. I've seen some dreadful French in my time, but its specific purpose is to include the non-initiated. And when they do speak to you, the people who use slang, well, they likely won't use it because they'll want to be well understood by yourself. So, in other words, if you're going to approach slang, what I would advise is to make a distinction between the overground as opposed to the underground. The overground slang, such as bagnole instead of car. So this is rather a question of register, voiture, bagnole, than really worry about the underground slang, which likely won't have much of an impact. And of course, I do have all this on my website and I do teach it. So thank you very much for watching. I'm Chris from We Communicate, a real teacher in real reality. I really do teach French and you can really find me. Thank you very much for watching. I hope it was useful. Goodbye.